I'm trying to say, of course, this is with the benefit of hindsight, that if you look at, again, Walton's statistics, from 1962 to 73, we had 10%, and we did have, real GDP growth per annum, combined with 1.5% annual increase in prices, with balance of payments in equilibrium. In the 70s, with 4 times as much income, we did worse. In one exceptional year, the GDP grew, and then we had all these bottlenecks. Therefore, again, if I were back in 72 and I was there at the time that we debated this in Ramsar, I was at the table. Had we continued on the same path, spent as much, let's say, on an increase of 20% per annum, it would have been quite likely that we would not have achieved the same criteria, the same outcome. And I tell you why. Because the world moved into an inflationary environment. Oil had something to do with it, but other commodities were also on rise. So it was the 60s that the world generally was much more stable in terms of prices. But yes, I would say that overall, had we continued to be aware, if you like, of how much can the economy absorb and be able to say no. It's easier to say no, I think, in a democracy, whereas it's much more difficult in a political system that you promise to deliver. This is what I'm trying to say. Let me give you some figures here. These are from Pesaran's article. The oil role in our GDP. 1960 to 78, the average growth rate of Iran's GDP, 8.37. Inflation, 6.18. 1979 to 2010, GDP real growth, 2.42. Inflation, 17.18. But overall, 1960 to 2010, real GDP, 4.64, inflation, 13.8. So oil is really a blessing. It certainly contributes enormously, as we have seen, to the growth of GDP, provided you don't overdo it. That's my message.
I have a long list of questions that are prepared, but I'll just go with one of them. And I guess the first one. One of the things that we've been discussing in this course so far has been the roots of the revolution and the very dynamics that led to the upcoming of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979.
Right.
And of course, one of the factors that we've undergone studying is the economic factor. Now, I'm curious to know, you as a banker yourself, being in that environment, how much weight do you put on the economic failure of the state as being responsible for the outbreak of the Islamic Revolution?
In my view, again, with the benefit of hindsight, I try to imply that I would not have given economics that much weight. In other words, firstly, we could have avoided it, but to me, the factors which, if you like, the economic issues were fed into was the nature of the state and the way in which it responded to those phenomena. In other words, I try to say that I don't know of many countries that inflation has been a cause of a revolution or a change of government. With that in mind, my interpretation was that too much investment showed that the failure of the state to deliver. And that in itself became the problem. Therefore, it was economics, if you like, in nature, but the result of it, that kind of a political system could not have handled it, if you know what I mean, because it had promised that I'm going to deliver. It was the 1962, many observers of Iran, or at least those who supported the system at the time, they thought that a pact had been made because of the Shah's reforms, which were at the same time, between the government, or i.e. the Shah, and the people, that you stay out of politics. In a way, some of the academics call it the end of politics in Iran. And I will deliver the goods. So any failure in delivering the goods becomes a breach of that contract between the two. So from that perspective, I'm putting it that it was economics, of course, mattered, but it was within the state not to go that far. And then it would have probably remained.
But it seems like when you're talking about this failure of the state, you're mainly referring to the economic aspect of it. Because when we study state, we look at the ideological apparatuses, the repressive apparatuses, military, army, so on and so forth. But it seems like, in your perspective, it's the economy that had a huge factor in the failure of the state and thus the outbreak of the revolution.
Now, to just make this a little bit comparative, is that the very same problem that Iran had because of the oil money, Saudi Arabia had, Libya had, Iraq had. Ideologically, they were different. And how would you explain the revolution in Iran when you take into account the problems that these other states had? Did they deal with it differently? Or is your lower population becomes the explanatory element?
If you look at the, firstly, that's a good question. Let me say that if I put the emphasis on economics of it, because this is the topic of today's discussion, I realize you have a series of seminars and you're going to deal with you have already dealt with some of these aspects. If you're asking me what caused the Iranian Revolution, that's a different story. I'll be happy to elaborate on that part, that you could talk about a fair degree. I mean, if you look at the calendar of events, it shows a number of things. If you read Abbas Milani's book about the Shah, you read a lot about the psychology of the individuals involved. You read about, I think it's fair to say that no event of such magnitude can be explained by one factor. By definition, not only by one factor, but also by a combination of factors, unless you also get the sequencing in a manner that will be feeding into that. You could have the same combination of factors in Saudi Arabia, nothing will happen. And more importantly, the individuals. What happened to them? There are a number of people, I've read articles about them, that they say everything being the same in Iran, if you want to speculate or try to find reasons. Every factor is the same. But without Ayatollah Khomeini's leadership, this would not have happened. And if it had happened, it wouldn't have happened in this sequence. Every member of the opposition under the Shah were willing to negotiate and settle with him, except him. So that changed the entire dynamics of all the events and the people's reactions. Then you create a bandwagon, and people jump on that one too. So there are many factors. I would be the last person to say that economics, caused it. I'm trying to tell you that within this seminar, it was the state's reaction to the economic reality which showed its failure to deal with it, and therefore that became a failure of the system rather than the policies of the system.
Well, I agree with you. When one reads the economic explanation of the revolution, it really doesn't explain. The inflation doesn't, the inequality and injustice that was brought about doesn't explain it, the illiteracy rate, urbanization rate doesn't explain it, because we have had it in other places and the revolution didn't happen. So, but you noted that it could have been avoided.
Yes.
By? economically?
Well,
Once you have all of those elements there, let's say you were in 1970s and the revolution was unfolding, what would have you done differently, or you could have recommended the Shah to do differently?
well, let me say that if the Shah had consulted me at the time, it doesn't necessarily mean that I would have offered him the right advice at that time. I may be thinking differently today than at that time there. But what is, with the benefit of hindsight again, and it was evident at that point of time as well, that kind of economic, let's assume for a moment, the 1960s will extrapolate into the 70s entirely. We have 10% or 8% real growth with only 2% inflation. Let's assume for a moment. And job is being created, etc. Now, clearly, that economy then would have been something like Korea, let's suppose, of its time, or Turkey of this time. And with that in mind, therefore, you would expect that what would be then lacking or lagging behind is the political system to match that. Because if that had grown that far, then the middle class had expanded much more. You would have had an urbanized, educated people who would have asked for a share in the political system. And therefore, that would have been the lag and the advice that I'm sure, people would have given the Shah, that here is the time, and he probably was thinking of it too, but he might have got the timing wrong, or he might have not been able so good at it in this game that he would be in other things. But it's very clear to me, and even if you look at some of the memoirs you read these days, that it was very important for people who actually participated in the system at that time, that they would have the freedom to discuss things. The failure of what I call Ramsar in terms of policy options was the failure of the technocrats being able to convince the decision makers, if you like, that the size of the budget was too much. It wasn't that it was not known. It was known, but they were overruled. In other words, the whole discussion at Ramsar was about the size of the budget. But eventually, the fifth plan was revised in order to assure 25% growth of GDP per year. Unheard of.
But you're offering an economic explanation, saying that if the budget of the fifth plan had not been doubled, the revolution would not have occurred. My argument would be, to counter, is that still could have been avoided. You have an exceptional year of something happens, goes crazy, and then you can readjust it backward and fix it up.
But I thought I just mentioned to you that certainly on the assumption of a steady economic growth without inflation, then the reform should have taken place in the political system of much more participation. And I'm saying to you that the Shah himself was also aware of it. Some of his experimentations were total failures, like Rastakhi's, and the way it was handled. But he was quite aware, and he was often open about it, that look, the way we are growing, nobody can manage this country single-handedly as I have.
Well, I think, and I want everyone to jump in, actually Iranian technocrats were reading Huntington, and that was their source of mistake. They thought that you have rapid economic development, you also have to have political opening, and I think the kiss of death for the regime was its political opening, because it couldn't then manage it. Once it opened it...
I disagree. The reason he got the timing wrong was that he opened up at the time of the state failure. What we just discussed was about the time that you said, let's extrapolate the 60s into 70s. Had he opened up at that time, that would have been a different dialogue, a discourse within it. He opened up at the time of Carter, he opened at the time of human rights, he opened at the time when there was no electricity, no water, ships were...
But here is my disagreement comes.
Okay.
Is that I've done a little bit of work on this human rights discourse in Iranian
Sure.
political discourse. From early 1960s, the Shah really takes it up. And in 1968, Iran hosts the very first UN Conference on Human Rights, 1968. And the kind of language that comes out of Iran is unheard of. And I think it actually starts then. A lot of people put the focus on Carter, coming much later, not understanding this earlier Iranian time that actually much of the political opening begins to start there, religious associations shape, and the kind of popularity that Shariati gets and Kafi gets and Falsafi gets has to do with that rather than with the Carter. The Carter is actually end of the game. It's not the beginning of it.
I quite agree. What you're really saying, I think Milani also elaborates on that extensively in his biography of the Shah, that he was being preoccupied with the foreign policy. I'm quoting Milani. He thought the threat to Iran was still from communism. And therefore, he felt that religion and religious network would be the best and secured defense of Iran's integrity vis-a-vis communism. And he therefore looked at, with the exception of a few militants, as in his description, the clergy being his natural allies.
It was his green movement, as Islam, green as Islam. Then
Milani quotes a figure, by the way, that there were 75,000 centers of learnings and talabe and irsbar in Iran, unheard of. I think under the Reza Shah, you could count them in your hands. And enormous expansion. The reason that Mr. Shariati could give his lectures, Hosseiniye Irshad, because of that, until they discovered that he's saying a bit more than they expected. It was all sponsored by the state indirectly, or at least tolerated. And there were many other centers. I know you may say that politicization in Iran also brings in religion, because people are religious. I think that's a fair point. And then whether you could cope with it or not, you know what I mean, whether that would then lead to a revolution. My answer would be, again, pure speculation, that would be a different kind of revolution. It would not have been the February 11, 1979 version of it. It would be much more, maybe a bit like the Turkish model, maybe.